Hi everyone, my name is Jeremy Siliperi. I'm an educational consultant with IU21. Today we're going to be talking about scaffolding behavior. So we're going to talk about how to improve behaviors, enhance relationships, and improve social and emotional learning. So the good news and the bad news is the same thing. So what really determines how well behaviors go in our classroom or don't has a lot to do, or everything to do, with our actions and reactions in our interactions with our students. So, oftentimes we can say, disabilities might play into it, home life might play into behavioral issues, things like that. But really the determining factor of whether things get worse or better, or easier or not so easy for us and for our students, really does rely on us. It has to do with our actions and, like I said, our reactions, depending on what's presented in front of us. So what does this have to do with scaffolding behavior? So scaffolding comes into play because we use these strategies, some of the strategies that we're going to talk about today, more often or less often based on the individual student needs that are, again, in front of us. We should begin to understand that negative behaviors are in fact skill deficits, right? These aren't kids. I always say this in behavior trainings: no student, I promise you, wakes up in the morning and says, I can't wait to be a pain today. You may think some of them do, but in reality, they don't. So we are dealing with students who have skill deficits, who want to do well in your class. So if we're teaching a new or an unmastered skill, we should utilize the same techniques and ideals that we would while teaching academic deficits. So chances are, if you're watching this, you may have watched some of our other scaffolding videos. And so you've seen some techniques on how to apply this idea that we give more or less supports depending on student need for academics. Well, the same thing should be applied for behavior. We have to kind of start to depersonalize that negative behavior, while at the same time work on forming more personal or better personal relationships with our students. So what does it mean to depersonalize negative behaviors? Again, we don't want to use language like, well, that kid's bad, they're always in trouble, that kind of thing. We want to take the behavior kind of and look at it outside of the individual student and think about what could be maintaining it and kind of work from there, rather than just kind of throwing our hands up and saying, well, I know that this student was difficult last year, I'm not surprised about this year. We can actually still affect a lot of change, even if we're talking at a secondary level. And I always say this: remember that you can't punish skills into a student, right? So if we're dealing with negative behaviors, then we're dealing with a skill deficit, which means we teach, not punish. Not that there's not a time and a place for appropriate consequences, but we really can't rely on that solely. So I have a lot of quotes from psychiatrists and educational researcher Chaim Ganot. So I came upon this quote probably 15 years ago in a training, in a de-escalation training that I was a part of, and it's kind of always stuck with me. So I'm going to read this, and then we'll sink into it a little more. So I've come to the frightening conclusion that I am the decisive element in the classroom. It's my personal approach that creates the climate. It's my daily mood that makes the weather. And as a teacher, I possess a tremendous power to make a child's life miserable or joyous. I can be a tool of torture or an instrument of inspiration. I can humiliate or heal. In all situations, it is my response that decides whether a crisis will be escalated or de-escalated, and a child humanized or dehumanized. So I just think that's one of the most powerful quotes I've ever read, and I continue to circle back to it again, probably 15 years after the first time I heard it. So I just wanted to kind of highlight a few things from that quote. Can you imagine going to a place each day where you feel humiliated, dehumanized, where you tend to escalate, where interactions and actions and tasks are miserable and it feels torturous? If that were the case, how long would you continue to go to that place, and how well would you perform, right? So that's kind of what we need to think of when we're thinking about our students, especially those who struggle behaviorally. So think again about the opposite. If you go every day to a place where you're inspired, where you feel a sense of healing when things go wrong, if you're joyful, if it's an easy place to de-escalate and you feel very humanized with your interactions with others, boy, isn't that a place that we'd all love to go each day? So I'm going to throughout this kind of make a couple comparisons between ourselves and our students, and I think that will hopefully help us, because remember, the secret to behavior management really is self-management. This quote really talks about your reactions to students' actions. So whether those actions, so student actions might be pretty pervasive at times and might be shocking, and behaviors might be big and bold. But again, it's how we react to them that kind of determines the next step, whether those things get better or they continue to get worse. So here are some factors that help us improve behaviors, again, enhance relationships and improve social emotional learning. And I could probably spend a half day on each of these things, but we're going to jump and I'll give you kind of an overview of what these 4 things are. So relationship building, differentiated behavior support, the ratio. If you've ever been in any training with me ever, you've probably heard me talk about the ratio. And then career ready skills. And you'll see, I think almost every slide has a little quote from my man there. So you can feel free to read those as we go through. So the first thing we'll talk about is relationship building. So an important thing to think about is that we need to be purposeful and intentional when we seek to build a relationship with students. So I think we tend to kind of approach relationships as kind of happening naturally or kind of organically. They kind of do or they don't, to varying degrees. But we really have to be purposeful and go out of our way to kind of create chances for us to build relationship with students. We must actually put them in our plans. We specifically have to plan for it so that we can ensure it happens. If we think 20, 30 years ago with some academic things, when we weren't using data, we weren't looking at, doing screeners, we were kind of just doing our best guess, and we probably did okay, but there was a lot of things that we missed. And so I think we're learning now that the way we approach relationships with the students is kind of the same. If we just leave it to happenstance, sometimes it'll happen, but a lot less than we think. So one study that I kind of latched onto from this year's PDE conference, these were high school students and teachers, and they were asked 3 simple questions. So the first one is, do teachers try to find out student interests? 82% of the teachers said yes, and only 1/3 of the students said yes. So do teachers try to connect, what students are learning with their interests and talents? Again, over 2/3 of the teachers said, of course we do. Only 1/4 of the students said yes. And then the last one, teachers help students see how classwork relates to interests and talents. Again, about 2/3 of the teachers thought it was happening, and this time less than 1/4 of the students thought that was happening. So again, I think and this kind of illustrates to us, if we leave it to happenstance and that building of relationships, we really miss the mark. We as educators think we're doing a decent job, but our students are telling us, at least through this study, that something different is going on. So again, if we're not purposeful, we can't really be confident that those things are happening. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview on a bit of an integrated lesson plan. I don't know that this is for public knowledge yet, but it is now. And you'll see it was a little blurry, so I did have to kind of retype some things. But this is just to give you an idea. In some ways, this looks like any other typical lesson plan. You've got your topic up here, you've got the standards you're working on. If I jump to the next page, you'll see I've got introduction, practice sequence, modeling, guided practice, all those kinds of things that you would see in a typical lesson plan. What's different, after your academic objective, you've got differentiated objectives. This says equitable access and inclusion. So right away, as you're making the plan and thinking about what it is you exactly want to teach, you're thinking about how you can make that inclusive for kids who struggle academically, behaviorally, or in any other way. At the same time, you're thinking about your social skills objectives. So what exactly do I want my students to kind of grow in socially as I'm doing this? So again, I can't think of a subject where you couldn't integrate some sort of social skills objectives. Why this is important for us, again, it doesn't matter if you're K-12, regular ed, or special ed. Students don't lose jobs because they don't have skills. People lose jobs because of social skills issues, right? They don't structure their time enough. They don't get along with their colleagues well enough. So these are the things that get people fired. So not having the skills, you probably won't get the interview, but what gets people fired or why they lose jobs or get frustrated and leave themselves is because of a lack of these other things. So it's important for us to kind of embed those again right away in the planning stage. And I would argue that doing it at the planning stage means you don't have to worry about it later. You've already got it on your mind and kind of baked into your lesson so that you're not in the middle of your lesson thinking about, oh, this is an opportunity for this or that. You've already set that up. Same with your behavioral expectations. We should have well-defined behavioral expectations. We'll talk a little bit more about them as we go on. But those are the things that you should say, these are kind of standards for my classroom. If you've got a school-wide system, I would encourage you to rely on that, even in your own classroom. Maybe you start to define it a little differently, which is pretty good and normal. But again, those overarching expectations should remain the same. The more they're uniform across a building, the easier it is for students to follow them. These over here, this is a really interesting part of the integrated lesson plan. These are, and they're again kind of fuzzy, so I rewrote them here for us. But these are strategies for low-level behavior. These are things that we can do on a daily basis, kind of on a universal level, to make sure we're seeing less negative behaviors and seeing more social emotional growth. So one is just active supervision. Are you moving around the room as much as you can be? So again, if you've given an assignment and kids are working independently, are you bouncing around, checking on kids, looking over their shoulder, asking them how it's going? Those type of things actually make a big difference with regard to decreasing the amount of behaviors you're going to see in your classroom. The more you actively supervise, the less likely kids are going to be off task. Another one that we'll talk about a lot is behavior-specific praise. So it's really good if you're telling kids that they're doing a nice job at something, but what really makes it so that you see those good behaviors repeated over time is if you're real specific. So it's not just thanks for being respectful, it's thanks for, that was really respectful when you got your materials out first time I asked. So, and again, these things don't have to sound kind of hokey and canned, but you really should be embedding in your language to kids really specific things. If you want, I always say, if you want to see it again tomorrow, you have to tell them what it looks like today. So nice job lining up first time I asked. Nice job being quiet, when you heard the announcements come on. So that when the announcements come on is the thing that they can do again tomorrow. So make sure you're being real specific when you're giving kids behavioral praise. Another thing that kind of helps is, and the special ed world has used this a lot, but I think it goes for all students, is what's known as high probability request sequencing. So again, I could spend probably a half a day on high probability sequencing, but really what it is this, is that I ask students to do things that I'm pretty certain they're going to do the first time I ask. It's something easy and quick that they can do, and it allows me to kind of, again, give some behavior specific praise. So let's say I've got a student comes in my math class and typically is kind of off task and doesn't like to get started. But I know that he kind of likes to do helpful stuff. I ask him to clean the board or check something for me. He'll do that kind of thing. So as soon as he walks in, I'm going, hey, come here. Hey, can you clean the board for me? And then he cleans it. I say, thanks a lot. Can you do this for me? Hey, class, make sure you're working on your independent assignment. And then I pull him aside and say, hey, when you're finished with that, would you mind getting started on your independent stuff too? So boom, rather than spend 15 minutes, getting angry and arguing about him getting started, I've already had a chance for him to follow my directions, receive reinforcement for it, receive some praise for it, and then boom, I throw the task that I want to get done in. So now, yeah, maybe it took 5 extra minutes for me to find some goofy tasks around the classroom to do. But if that means he sits and starts his work after that 5 minutes, I've just gained some time. And again, I've built this idea that complying with me is a good idea and interacting with me is a good idea. And so those things don't become so aversive and you don't have that confrontational relationships start to build, which really just lends itself to more and more negative behaviors over time. Another kind of an easy thing to build in is instructional choice. So whenever you can give a student a choice, do you want to do this first or that first, or you can do this, and those kind of things really do make a difference. Because even if all those tasks are kind of non-preferred, just by the nature of, I'll say, I'm going to do this second task, I've chosen to do it, even though I might not be crazy about doing it. But again, just being able to choose it, that means I have now decided to do it myself. So that really does, again, lend itself to more compliance and more completion of work. The next one is instructional feedback. So again, how many of us have written lesson plans for a principal that never get looked at? And every Monday when you hand it in, for however many weeks a year, it's aggravating because why am I doing this every week and he never looks at it? So imagine what your students feel like if they're not getting feedback. So again, if you want them to be invested and you want to show them that the tasks you ask them are important and worthwhile, feedback is an important part of that. And we'll talk a little bit more about that because that can be done in a specific way to build relationships as well. A big one that's really being talked about on really national level is this idea of opportunities to respond. So the more a student responds to questions or comments or things that are you're putting out to the class, the more their brains on, like instead of hands on, their brains on and learning. So we tend as teachers to call on students who will have the right answer, because I spent all this time on this awesome lesson and I want it to go smoothly, and I know this kid's not going to get it, so I'm not going to ask him to answer the question. But in reality, that's exactly who you need to call on. So the student with their hand up, like if you're a Harry Potter fan, Hermione with her hand up, right? She's fine. She knows the answer. But the student who's kind of quiet in the back, who doesn't raise their hand, that's the student you should be giving opportunities to respond so that they're starting to engage in the lesson. And again, that's exactly where scaffolding comes into play. So I might change the way I ask the question or rephrase it to kind of coax the right answer into that student. And now they're involved in the lesson, they're involved in the thinking, and that's when learning happens. The last thing that we talked about here is the idea of pre-correction. So in education, what we typically do, let's say, and I'll choose a spelling quiz because that's an easy example, is I have my kiddos study spelling and I give them a quiz to see, who knows them. And boy, 4 of my kids only got half of them right. So, I pull them aside, I remediate, or someone else steps in to help with remediation. And then when I give the test, boom, now they've got a few more right. So that's not terrible, but what is bad about that is you've set up a system where kids fail first. So let's think if I could turn that on its head a little bit, and I'm not expending any more time or energy. So whether it's me pulling kids aside, those kids who traditionally struggle, or the person who comes in usually to remediate, instead of remediating before the lesson, we're reviewing the words first. So guess what, on that quiz, instead of getting only half of the 10 words right, now they got 7 or 8. Right? So now they're actually successful because we've set them up prior to the lesson with some knowledge base. If you've got kiddos who come from low SES backgrounds and don't have a ton of background knowledge, they haven't been a lot of cool places. If I'm going to read a book about the zoo and a kid's never been to a zoo, that's going to feel kind of foreign to them. But if I pull them aside beforehand and say, hey, we're going to talk about zoos for 10 minutes. You know what a zoo is? And the kids say no, and then you go through. And then when you teach your lesson that involves a story and you start asking comprehension questions, now they've got background knowledge to go off of. So pre-correction is this idea that you take the kids you know are going to struggle in certain areas, and you kind of give them some of the basics before you jump into your general ed lesson for everyone. And that way they can participate better, they can be more successful, and then how much time you have to spend in remediation is less, right? Because you've set them up just to be successful in the overall lesson. So you can see here how this integrated lesson plan really pulls in some of these ideas of social skills, behavioral expectations, and then it even, like I said, has some strategies that, my little graphic kind of covers it up, but you can actually check off like, oh, I'll use active supervision and pre-correction for this lesson. And then you can kind of check for yourself and say, boy, I'm doing a lot of that, but I don't really do a lot of opportunities to respond. I better focus on that next month, something like that. And that kind of plays into the bottom part of the lesson plan. So again, along the left here, it's just kind of traditional, what you would see on any lesson plan template. But here's the teacher reflection part. Here's what's a little different. So all of those things that we just talked about are listed across here, and then you can kind of gauge for yourself. Some people have even used this tool where they've recorded themselves or had a colleague fill this out for them and really saw, where their strengths lied in those using those strategies and where they really wanted to grow. So I think that's a pretty powerful idea. So staying on this idea of building relationships, sometimes we're quick to kind of say no and then move on. So, what's 2 + 5? And someone says 8, and you say, no, that's not right. And then you call the next kid, they say 7, and you say, great job, and you move on. But what the problem with that is, especially for our kids who struggle, is that kind of instantly shuts them down. It shuts down the idea that thinking about this lesson is worthwhile, or answering questions is worthwhile, or even interacting, because now I feel kind of goofy because I got that question wrong. Like those things kind of lend themselves to kids not participating in the future. And also that kind of idea, like, how can I build a relationship with the teacher. Again, if you kind of know and move on, think about how that would feel. We've all been in grad classes, we've all been in undergrad. Like it's not a great feeling, right? So instead you can do simple things like ask a kid what they were thinking. So if it's a math, because there's been times, I'll tell you, where I've worked with students where the answer seemed really off to me. So if I asked, what were you thinking? And they started to explain it, I thought, boy, the way they understood the question, their answer kind of made sense. So I gave me the opportunity to say that and then re-explain the question so they could get it right, as opposed to just, no, that was wrong. Who's got the right answer? Ask kids how they arrived at the answer. How'd you get that? What made you say that when this and that? So those are just things you can say kind of instead of no and moving on. Really stop. And this also plays into that opportunities to respond. I want to kind of dig into it a little bit, dig into the thinking that my students are doing. So by doing that, really now the student starts to see me as a resource. I'm someone who helps them arrive at right answers. So when we talk about relationship building, doing these kind of academic interventions really does foster a good relationship, because again, I'm seen as someone to go to when you don't know things. And isn't that kind of what all teachers want from our students? Think about putting value into the thinking and not just the correctness of the answers. So again, that I really love the way that we're thinking about that, or I see where you were going, but this is how I want you to look at it. So again, I'm not watering down what I want to teach or making wrong answers right. But really what I'm doing is kind of putting this emphasis on engagement and putting an emphasis on, hey, you and I are in this together, and I'm going to help you work through difficult content so that you arrive at the right answers. But the fact that you're kind of hanging in there with me and thinking this through is really what I'm impressed with as a teacher, right? And that's really going to bolster kids' self-confidence, their pride in their work, all the things that we want to see grow, all that intrinsic stuff that we want to see happen for our kids. So there was an interesting study that I think I saw at this year's PDE conference, where I believe it was seventh graders. There's 2 seventh grades. And so one was given kind of traditional feedback, on their academics. So it was, crossed off X's and yeses and not a lot written from the teacher, apart from a good job or better luck next time kind of thing. And the other 7th grade, the teacher gave feedback that was meant to build the relationship. So I know you tried hard on this. Can I see you fix the ones you missed? I know you work, that kind of language, that was the only thing that was different between these 2 7th grades. The teaching styles were pretty close, but really one just kind of gave straight up academic kind of dry feedback, and one really made it personable and personal. And then guess what? They follow these kids to high school. So the 7th graders who had that kind of personal relationship building feedback, those kiddos actually corrected more on their own in the 7th grade that year. But then in high school, they had less discipline referrals, less truancy, and less dropout. And the only difference, again, was that the teachers wrote things that built relationships when they were giving academic feedback. So again, they weren't watering down. They weren't saying they got stuff right that they didn't. But what they were doing is kind of adding this idea to the feedback of high expectations and high hopes for the kids. I know you can do this better. Take another look at numbers 3, 4, and 7, whatever. But again, adding that personal piece, kids were much more invested in their academics rather than just wrong, right, next. So another thing that we can kind of do to build relationships, again, is this idea of sharing power with students when possible. So that's an idea of choice. If you can build choice into what you're doing, that always lends itself not only to compliance, which it does, but also to this idea, again, that school is a good place to come and learn. It's not a place where I'm just made to do things all day, especially for kids who struggle. That's exactly how it feels. I say, if you had to go to work every day and only do the parts of your job that were really difficult, how long would you work there before you look for something else, right? And we expect some kids to do this, from age 5 to 21. So let's make sure that we're kind of working to build those relationships. And again, like I said, when we first began, that we're really being purposeful. Not just waiting for opportunities to build relationships, but really kind of thinking in advance in the planning stages. You know what, these 3 kids, I really think I need to connect with. What can I do about that? You know what, I think 2 of them are into this team and this kiddo's into this music. So I'm going to try to spark up a conversation about those things with these students. That kind of stuff goes a long way. Those things have academic implications later because they help to build relationships. So the next thing that we can talk about is differentiated behavior support. So classroom behavior systems can be scaffolded to meet the needs of individual students. So most classrooms, again, doesn't matter if you're kindergarten or 12th grade, have some kind of behavioral expectations that all kids need to follow. You might have school-wide in your school, which is great. I would lean on that. But at the same time, you don't have to have that in order to do what we're going to talk about. So you should have 3 to 5 positively stated behavioral expectations. So again, tell kids what to do. You're going to be this or act like that, not stop and don't. 3 to 5, 2 is too little, and really 5 and more is going to get difficult for you to remember, and for the kids to really, to have it sink in and stay. So I like 3 and 4. Research says the 5 is okay too. But whatever those expectations are, you should explicitly teach them to all students. So directly tell them what it means to be responsible in your class. If that's one of your expectations, that, oh yeah, I want all kids to be responsible, then you have to tell them what that looks like. That means you're not getting out of your seat. That means you're not sharpening pencils in the middle of my lesson. That means you're raising your hand. Whatever it needs to look like for your room, make sure that that's explicitly taught out loud to all kids. And then determine some way to reinforce that. If we want that to happen, there should be some way to reinforce it. Now, again, in general ed, maybe that's we're all working towards this or that, or if we do this or that for 2 weeks. I was in a school yesterday and they had all kinds of fun, different things. Every classroom had their own kind of thing. They all had the same expectations, but a different way to reinforce it. And that was great. So it gave the teacher some autonomy to kind of figure out how to make these things important to my kids all day. So that's for everybody. So now let's think about our students who might struggle. And I bolded this first bullet point. Think about how you can increase the rate of reinforcement for individual students who struggle. So again, if I've got my 3 classroom rules and, if we do a good job, we do this once a month or we do this or that, and there's a way that I track it and I have a thingy on the board and stuff. But now I've got 2 kids who really struggle. So I'm not going to differ from those initial classroom-wide expectations. I'm just going to think how to reinforce them more often. So for most of my class, if we hand in X number of assignments each month, then I do this once a month, whatever that is. They all get stickers or candy or pizza or whatever. It doesn't even have to be that big or exciting. They can do free choice period, whatever. But that's not really enough for these 2-3 kiddos that I have in my class. So same expectation, handing in assignments, but rather than the expectation of 16 out of 20 handed in for the month, I'm going, for these 2 kids, if you hand in 4 by the end of the week, by the way, that's the same expectation as the rest of the class, or for this kiddo, it's 8 every 2 weeks because he doesn't need quite as much support. And then there's some kind of added incentive in there for those kids who can meet those standards. So in reality, I haven't changed the standard for those kids. If I say, all right, class, 16 assignments in by the end of the month out of 20, and whatever happens, something fun and awesome, I'm not changing that expectation, but I'm giving kids reinforcement for those things in smaller increments, right? So again, for these 2 kids, I'm saying, I got to reinforce them every week. And for this kiddo, he needs a little less than them, but not as much as the rest of the class. So, every 2 weeks, I'm going to check in with them, make sure you got your 8 assignments in. Again, same expectation. I'm just reinforcing it more often. And again, so you can grow that or shrink that as much as needed. As the kid who needs it twice a month starts to do really well, you can kind of let go of it and see if the classroom-wide system works. And maybe those kids who you're checking in every week, you move them to every 2 weeks. Again, that's where that scaffolding comes into place. As they're ready for more intensive things like needing less support, you move them there. But then again, you can always kind of shift it back if you need to. If you move a student to the same universal plan that everybody else is doing and they're struggling a lot, well, then you can put some more things in place. Say, listen, I see you're struggling with your assignments. You haven't gotten them in the last couple of weeks. So I'll tell you what, and you start over again with once or every 2 weeks or something. Think about when it would work for you to deliver reinforcement and plan for it. I worked with with a teacher the other day who she was saying, like, I got a lot of things going on in the morning. It was an elementary teacher. She was special ed, and she had like a morning meeting thing that she was doing, and it got really complicated because it's different student needs and things were going on. It was a real busy time. So, and my suggestion to her was reinforcing this student for compliance more than she was. She was doing a great job, but I was saying, well, she might just need more of what you're doing. And she kind of said, well, I'm not sure how to do that because I'm doing 8 other things at the same time. So I said, well, build it into your day. So know that, you have 5, 6 activities you do during morning routine. So after every other one, look to reinforce. If the student's doing whatever behavior it is that you like, you reinforce it. If not, you don't. But you've planned when you're going to look and see, do I need to reinforce that? And once it was built in, then again, she didn't have to think about it so much. She didn't have to worry about catching the kid when she was being good, although that's wonderful too. But she again kind of made it part of her morning routine, not everybody's morning routine, but her morning routine. And so she didn't really then have to exert a lot of energy or time to making sure that it happened. So the kid's reinforcement levels went up for doing what she was supposed to. It was sitting in her seat. This kid kind of flopped all around sometimes. And then it really wasn't a ton of work for her once she figured out when she wanted to do it, right? It was just a matter of kind of having those things on hand to reinforce or say, nice job, I really love how you're sitting in your seat, that kind of stuff. But it was really just kind of making sure it was baked into the lesson in the beginning, and then it kind of happened. Consider when you should reteach expectations. So again, we've got those classroom-wide things. And I taught everybody what it means to be responsible in my room. But again, these 3 kiddos over here are not quite getting it. So maybe I set up an independent work period and I bring those 3 kids over and say, listen, we're going to talk about what it means again. And you reteach that expectation to those students. And then quickly give them a chance to do well and get reinforced for it. And then when possible, embed that pre-teaching into directions for all. So again, if let's say kids are going to split up into groups and they already kind of know their groups, but you're kind of ending your whole group lesson and you're ready for them to move on, embed right in those directions how you want it to look. If you remember back to that lesson plan, it had social skill that you want to work on and expectation you want to work on. So think about that with directions. So, all right, class, we're going to break up into our groups now to work on our projects. Let's make sure that we're being responsible and making sure that everybody knows what their job is. Does everyone know what their job is? Okay, great. Remember, part of being responsible is doing that job. Part of being respectful today is making sure we're using 6-inch voices so we're not disturbing other groups. Everybody ready? And boom, you can move on. So, but just make sure that that's really, really, really explicit up front. So other differentiated behavior supports. There are some strategies that we would call high yield strategies. So these are academic strategies for academic success, but also breeds good behavior. It's also good behavior techniques, good behavior interventions. So reciprocal teaching, having kids teach either to you or teach content to kids in their group that they become the expert on, or to whole group, whatever that looks like. And I'm sure we've all seen that in undergraduate studies where you learn most by teaching. So giving students the opportunity to do that, you can see how that, we know how that has academic implications in a good way. It also has behavioral implications, because if I'm up there, the expert talking and telling, well, I want everybody paying attention to what I'm saying, right? So that lends itself to be a good behavioral and academic strategy. So we talked about building relationship. I'll tell you, I've worked in some pretty intensive behavioral settings, from center-based emotional support to mental health in school settings like partial hospitalization, or an IU-21, we call it sites. I've worked in those kinds of programs. And really what makes the difference at the end of the day is your relationship with students. We used to jokingly, but not jokingly, say they're less likely to hit you if they like you. But also that goes with everything else. So they're much more likely to comply, even if they don't like the task and it's difficult, if they like you. So if they'll do it for you, even if they don't want to do it for themselves sometimes. And that's where that relationship can be really powerful. Again, we talked about providing feedback. That's a huge one. The more specific and the more we build relationship through what we're kind of just simply writing on a student's paper before we hand it in, that has huge academic and behavioral implications. And again, how much we need to do that, there's that scaffolding piece, depends on what the student's needs are. teaching students to self-verbalize, so kind of that self-management piece when they're frustrated, when they're confused, when they're not sure of what your directions are. If we can teach them how to verbalize those things, then again, we'll see much less behaviors, much less negative behaviors. And that kind of goes along with the last one, that metacognition strategies. So that really is just kind of thinking about thinking, right? So, okay, you were frustrated. Well, how did your body feel? What made you frustrated? What was the situation? Because next time you're probably going to run into a similar situation. So let's talk about that. That's what metacognition strategies are, really. It's basically the basics of cognitive behavioral therapy, where you're really, again, thinking about your thinking and recognizing what's going on internally so that you can, intervene for yourself before you get escalated. And that's really the hope of what that does. But again, that's for extreme cases, but it also works kind of for typical students and kids who might struggle, who are appropriately placed into general ed as well. And then, interestingly enough, low yield strategies, ability grouping, reduced class sizes. That one always surprises me, by the way. And adding finances, throwing money and people at situations doesn't necessarily, research-wise, shows us that doesn't necessarily breed more academic and behavioral success. Here we are at the ratio, my favorite. So again, if you've ever been in any talk with or in service with me, I've talked about the ratio. So this speaks to the number of times you acknowledge positive student behavior compared to how many times you've given them directions or corrections or redirections. So for students, there's this idea of the interaction between you and the teacher being positive or negative, and so if the more you're giving good feedback or what a student perceives as positive compared to how much you're redirecting, then you're going to see a huge payoff behaviorally, socially, emotionally, and academically. The ratio, interestingly enough, is if you give an insert, or if I give an in-service on social emotional learning, school-wide positive behavior supports, trauma-informed care, all of those kind of buzz things right now, they all kind of meet at the ratio. So it really has to do with just your basic interactions with students, right? It goes back to slide number 1, where we said, here's the good news and the bad news, right? The more that we're telling kids what they're doing correctly, the less we have to correct them about the stuff they're not doing. Just a thing to remember, that the acknowledgements must be specific and immediate. So the quicker you get them after the behavior in there. So if I say, oh, I really love the way you guys lined up like that, that was perfect. First time I asked, no arguments. If that's something that we're working on, I'm going to see that more and more often. Sometimes we struggle with the kids who do require redirection and correction very often because we think, well, boy, that means I'm going to have to tell them they're doing a nice job like 100 times a day. And my answer to that is correct, because it's about the ratio, not necessarily the total amounts. So make sure that we're working towards a higher ratio. So the last little bullet point here, I said, I've seen research as low as 4-to-1 all the way up to 8-to-1 as far as what a student requires that ratio to look like. And I'm going to remind us all at this point that this is regular ed kids. This is your average typical student. That's how much reinforcement for positive that they need, or I shouldn't say reinforcement, but how much positive speak they need around what they're doing well. I'll give you a quick example. Have you ever worked somewhere where there's this other person you work with, and if you're both walking down the hallway, you're not sure if that person is going to rip your head off or give you a hug? That's a 1-to-1 ratio. So think about, as you turn the corner and see that person in the hallway and you go, I can't turn around now, it's too late. Think about how your stomach feels, how your blood pressure goes, what your head feels like as you get closer to that person. So that's a 1-to-1 ratio. We don't want our kids walking into our classroom feeling that, right? So we've got to at least be on the positive side with our ratios, or with our individual interactions with kids, but we should continuously try to up that ratio. Again, 4-to-1 is a great place to start, although that's kind of hard for us to get to train ourselves. But once you've got in that habit, to be honest, to go from 2-to-1 to 4-to-1 is tough. Once you hit 4-to-1 to 8-to-1, that's easy, because you've already started to train yourself to do that. I worked with a teacher who his ratio to students, no lie, was probably about 10 or 12-to-1. everything a student in our room did well, he marked the occasion. And this was a school-based partial hospitalization classroom, and it looked like learning support most of the time. And I would say this is probably why. Everything any kid did that he asked them to, he thanked them for. And again, there was real payoff in relationships and academics and behaviors. So again, that's why I always talk about the ratio, no matter what in-service you hear me there to give that day. So the last few things that we're going to talk about is career ready skills. So this is really interesting. These are, and I put the link here. If you've got your phone, go ahead and snap a picture of that. Or you can go on PDE or Patton's website and find links to this as well. Or if you just put in PA career ready skills in Google, you'll find it there as well. So basically, we don't have at this time in Pennsylvania true academic standards for these types of things, because standards we know have to be legislated, but PDE did come out with a list of things. And I shouldn't say they just came out with it. They spent years in research and discussion with people in the state, business leaders, as well as higher ed people, to decide what are these skills that people need. So remember we talked earlier about people don't lose jobs because they don't have the skill for it. People are losing jobs or leaving jobs because of other issues, right? So there's three kind of big headers or topics. So the first one is self-awareness and self-management. So these are skills to understand, manage your own behaviors, to set goals for yourself, recognize your own internal feelings, and respond effectively to challenges. Those are things that we all do on a daily basis at home and at work. So we've got to make sure that we're building those things up in our students as well if we want them to be successful adults. So let's think of, brass tacks, why does public school exist? Because we want to put people back into our communities who understand and manage their own behaviors, set goals, recognize their own feelings, respond effectively to challenges, and are productive members of our communities. That's why we exist. So to forego self-awareness, self-management, these other career-ready skills really is counterproductive to what schools are there to do, especially if we just say we're just going to focus on our academic subject area. The second kind of big bullet under career ready skills is the establishing and maintaining relationships. So these are skills that support healthy relationships, awareness and respect for diversity. And you don't have to agree with everyone, but if you're going to work in a pluralistic community like most American communities, you've got to be able to be aware and respectful of others. You've got to be an effective communicator and conflict resolver. You've got to be able to effectively come to compromise when needed. I will refrain from further comment in that area. Okay, social skills or problem solving is the last kind of big header that career ready skills will show you. And I'll tell you, you could spend, again, I could spend a whole day on career ready skills just using the Patton and PDE website resources. So I'll leave that for you to dig into deeper. But I do want you to know that they're there and what they're there for and how you can then use them in that integrated lesson plan. This is a great place to look to find some of that where it said, remember, social skills that you're going to work on. This is a great place to find it because, again, it has academic kind of post-secondary implications. That's where it came from, and it just happens to be that those are also social emotional standards, for lack of a better word. So problem solving and social skills, skills that support understanding social norms. And again, those change depending on where we are. So that's important to be able to know that and shift. These are skills that support responsible choices and engage effectively in diverse contexts. So again, the way I talk in the break room at work is different. The way I talk at home with my family might be different. Certain topics are taboo in certain places and aren't in others. Certain language is taboo in certain places and not others. So it's important that we understand, first of all, that context does matter, and then also kind of what those norms are. And students learn that by understanding, even within the school, that there are different norms and different things. So again, not terribly different. What's expected in algebra is not drastically different than the biology room. But again, it's important that students understand this idea that context matters and that we can live and march through our day going in and out of different contexts, and that those contexts can be pretty diverse. So here's just a quick big five. These are evidence-based practices for behavior, but also kind of help to supplement those four things that those four big headers that we talked about so far today. We want to maximize structure in our classroom when possible. So again, you've got expectations, you've taught those expectations, you've taught routines. So in my classroom, if you need a pencil, you can get up and get one. In the classroom next door, you might raise your hand. So either of those is fine, but what's important is that we've structured it and taught it. We should post, teach, review, monitor, and reinforce positively stated expectations. So again, we should be, and I would say this, if you've got positively stated expectations in your classroom and or school, you should be using that language both when you direct, redirect, and praise kids. So if it's important that kids are acting responsibly and they're not, I would say that doesn't look really responsible right now when you're horsing around in the hallway. So I'm using that language all the time because I'm starting to help students who struggle define what it means to be responsible with examples and non-examples kind of all day long. We should actively engage students in observable ways. Again, those opportunities to respond is a great way to kind of pull kids into your lesson. Establish a continuum of strategies for responding to appropriate behavior. We all know that we should have kind of a bag of tricks, for lack of a better term, of what to do when kids misbehave. If first offense is this, second offense is that. If it's really severe, it's this. If it's not so bad, it's that. But we should also have the same thing on the front of our minds for students who do well. So that again, we're hitting a high ratio, that we're reinforcing what needs to get reinforced, so that we're marking the occasion of behaviors we saw today, so that hopefully we see them again tomorrow. And again, the last one there, again, have those continuum of strategies for responding to inappropriate behavior. Because what you don't want to do is respond when your blood pressure is up after a kid has misbehaved, right? You want to make sure that you're calm, cool, and collected, and you're responding to the behavior, not the way the student made you feel. And that is a lot easier said than done. I always say behavior interventions are simple, but they are not easy. And this is something to help that. So make sure you've got in your mind today, before you walk into your class tomorrow, what you're going to do if kids are doing well, what you're going to do if kids are not doing well, what are you going to do with most of the kids doing well and these four aren't, and vice versa. So again, having those kind of talks, I used to talk to my steering wheel on the way home from work as I would kind of work through this stuff and think about what I could do again tomorrow to kind of affect some positive change. And these are the types of things that you should be kind of mulling over in your head. Or you can ask yourself these questions. How do I maximize structure? Have I taught routines and expectations? Maybe I did, but they were kind of general. Maybe I need to teach some more routines more specifically, or what am I? Because you know what? They need to be sitting quietly when I'm talking, but if they're a group work, they can talk to each other. They need to raise their hand if it's whole group, but not if it's sitting small group. So maybe those are some things that I have to explicitly teach what those expectations are, even in the context of my own classroom. Do you use prompts and pre-correct? So again, am I setting students up in the directions I'm giving to meet the expectations? And again, using your language from a school-wide program or your own classroom expectations is key here. Did I give specific contingent praise? So again, I'm laying it out for the student what I like that they did in real specific terms. Saying good job, nice job, and I'm glad you did that are nice. But to take it the step further, you really have to start to get specific about what you're seeing, so that again, you see it again tomorrow. Were struggling students given opportunities to respond? So again, academically and or behaviorally struggling students tend not to get called on or given as many OTRs. Of course, there's an acronym for that, opportunities to respond. So we have to look to increase those opportunities for those students. And I'll tell you what, again, I came from working in ES settings, and I've gotten lots of answers that were smart alecky, because that's a nice avoidance thing if I don't know the answer. But if I, as the teacher, ignore that and persist with my questioning, 9 times out of 10, the kid will knock that off. See, or they're really just interested in them getting the right answer, and they'll start to hang in there with you. And it also teaches the other kids that we're not worried about bad answers. We're going to keep working on what's right. and we're not going to get distracted, laugh, and giggle at things that are wrong. And that sets a tone for those students who have academic issues. So do you use active supervision? Are you moving around the classroom? Actively, and it's a little tougher this year, I'm sure, but again, making sure that you're kind of staying on top of things and seeing issues right away. And how do I plan on building relationships during each lesson? So again, whether you're secondary and you've got kids just 42 minutes a day, or you're elementary and you see a kid most of the day, when and where are you going to take the opportunity to try to somehow build a relationship with each of your students, especially those that are keeping you at arm's length? And I think that's where we'll stop for today. Thanks everyone for sticking in there with me today. That was a nice long one. I appreciate everyone watching today, and I hope you have a great rest of your school year. Unless you're watching this in summer, good luck next year. And hopefully you took something away from today. Thanks so much.